Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 7 running back rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with waiver wires. Again, we want to go ahead and make an update to yesterday's waiver wire video, as we saw a huge breakout performance from Latavius Murray, as it looks like Melvin Gordon is no longer going to be utilized in said offense. We'll talk about that in just a moment. After we talk about the waiver wire portion, we'll then transition to our running back matchups for Week 7, giving us all perspective as to which defenses are giving up the most points to opposing running backs thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format, meaning everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or full PPR league. After we talk about matchups, then we'll transition to our top 36 running back rankings for the week, as I'll throw a bunch of statistics at you guys in order to justify the reasons and, of course, help you make the right decisions going into Week 7. Before we begin, I want to thank you guys for supporting the channel with your viewership, of course, clicking the like button and commenting down below. If you have not yet already and you want daily fantasy football content in your subscriber box, the best way to do it is to go down below, click that subscribe button, and help us get to our goal of 70,000 subscribers. So if you haven't yet already and you're trying to help yourself win a 2022 fantasy football championship, that's the best way of going about it. Also, for those of you guys who want to play more fantasy football outside of your own leagues, my number one suggestion would be to go ahead and travel down to the description of the video and travel to Prize Picks. Again, there's a link down there for those of you who are interested in playing daily fantasy, whether it is NFL, MLB, NBA that's coming up. Of course, there's a bunch of ways to do it via Prize Picks. Put together some entries and bring home some W's. So if you go ahead, check that out and use promo code Andrew today. When you sign up and make a first-time deposit, you'll be given a first-time deposit match upwards of $100. Again, that's using promo code Andrew. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about our Week 7 waiver wires, specifically, really quickly, at the running back position. The only update I wanted to make was moving Latavius Murray to the top of the list. Because of the events of last night, what we saw in the second half, the fact that Melvin Gordon did not play a single snap there, and the fact that Latavius Murray looks like he is going to be the lead back for this team going forward, perhaps the Denver Broncos are going to be trading Melvin Gordon. You want to keep Melvin Gordon on roster, but currently, Latavius Murray is available in a lot of formats and in a lot of leagues. So if, in fact, you have an opportunity to go ahead, snag him, he could be the starting running back at the Denver Broncos rest of the way, which really doesn't mean much considering the Broncos offense isn't that high powered, but in great matchups, he can obviously put together a great performance, fall into the end zone, and be a decent RB2 option going forward. So that's the number one thing that I wanted to mention. Outside of that, it'll continue with Kenyan Drake as our number 2, and then the rest of the guys that I mentioned on yesterday's video. If you haven't checked that out, it's on the channel. Check it out. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about our Week 7 matchups at the running back position. As you can see immediately to the right of me, I've gone ahead and compiled the statistics that defenses have given up to opposing running backs thus far this season on average from weeks 1 through 6. Of course, all the statistics that are included with rushing attempts, rushing yards, touchdowns, all the way to targets, receptions, and all the receiving work that running backs have been able to put up against opposing defenses. Now, going into this upcoming week, it is important to remember that there are 4 teams on bye. These 4 teams are actually some of the best in the league, where we have the Buffalo Bills, we have the Los Angeles Rams, the Philadelphia Eagles, and the Minnesota Vikings. So there's going to be a lot of prospects that are typically, automatic starts for our teams that are not going to be available for us. But with that being said, just remember that they are not available. But either way, as you go ahead and absorb some of the information that you can see on screen, I wanted to go ahead and transition to isolating running back rushing statistics alone, because what the data has proven over the last couple years is that in order to determine the strength of schedule for a running back, we have to exclude the potential of receiving work allowed by defense, because the only determining factor as to whether or not a running back succeeds in the receiving game is how many targets he gets from his own team and how much they want to utilize him in that aspect of the game. So when we isolate rushing statistics alone, attempts, rushing yards, and rushing touchdowns, we have found that the Detroit Lions, Cleveland Browns, Houston Texans, they are the worst teams in terms of stopping the run. They're giving up a boatload of points and are obviously automatic start matchups for our running backs going into the week. These are typically teams that we want to hunt after and play those running backs against them. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have the New England Patriots that have still yet to give up a rushing touchdown to an opposing running back this season, followed by the Buffalo Bills, who are on a bye week, but Cincinnati Bengals, San Francisco 49ers, these defenses obviously playing extremely well. Alvin Kamara, despite the fact that he had a great game this last week against Cincinnati, wasn't able to find the end zone. The San Francisco 49ers, even though there was a boatload of yards ran on them, it took like 30 some odd attempts in order to gather that many yards. So either way, they're still a stout run stopping defense, and we'll talk about that as we progress throughout today's video. Of course, you will see the transition of these overall matchups on the screen. That is exactly why I've designated every single matchup with a 1 to 5 star rating. 5-star being the best potential matchup in the given week, 1-star being the worst. Also with demonstrating on screen fantasy points allowed, specifically in the running game. So let's transition to our top 36 running back standings. Beginning with our number 1, we have Austin Ekeler. Again, Austin Ekeler currently is the number 1 running back in fantasy football in a half PPR scoring format. I mean, as of this current moment in time, despite the fact that a lot of people have been commenting down below or messaging me on, the different socials and saying, Andrew, Austin Ekeler isn't playing enough. He needs to get more opportunities. I understand that you're frustrated, but just take into account, last night on Monday Night Football, he still had a total of 30 opportunities and 24 total touches. That in itself is unbelievable. 16 targets and 10 total receptions last night. Over the course of the first 6 weeks of the season, 49 targets and 41 receptions. That's the 6th most receptions amongst all players in the National Football League right now, including running backs, tight ends, and wide receivers. Unbelievable numbers. And for those of you who may be thinking, Andrew, he's not playing enough. The stats are not high enough. Too many touches are going in the direction of Sony Michel or Joshua Kelly on a weekly basis. I want to put this in perspective. When you go ahead and look at weeks 1 through 6 of this year, he has played 59.17% of the offensive snaps. If you go back to last season, weeks 1 through 6, he played 64.39% of the offensive snaps. Sure, he has played about 5% less of the offensive snaps. Yet, when you go ahead and compare the fantasy point contributions, this year, in the first 6 weeks, 117.5. Last year, first 6 weeks, 115.3. He is on an identical pace, and he has scored 6 touchdowns in the last 3 weeks. I've told you guys, Austin Ekeler is not going to change. He's going to continue to be in this conversation, and he continues to hold as such, taking on the Seattle Seahawks, who have given up a boatload of yards to opposing running backs as of late. 3 100-yard running backs against them in the last 4 weeks. We'll take that with Austin Ekeler as our number 1. Moving on, we have Saquon Barkley as our number 2, taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars. Saquon Barkley, of course, one of the better backs in the National Football League. Unfortunately for many of us, you may have lost by 6 points if, in fact, Saquon Barkley had fallen into the end zone because the Baltimore Ravens were letting him score, but instead he slid on the 1-yard line with less than 2 minutes in the game. You could have had an influx of 6 fantasy points there, but either way, he'd rather go ahead and lock down the win, and I respect that. But for fantasy purposes, it definitely hurts. That all being mentioned, when we talk about the efficiency and how well Saquon Barkley has played this year, he has been averaging 3.47 yards per carry after contact. So not only has he been averaging a great amount of yards, over 5 per carry this season, but after contact, 3.47. When we compare that to other running backs like Leonard Fournette, Joe Mixon, and Najee Harris, those running backs, not even after contact, just regular rushing attempts. Fournette is only averaging 3.61. Mixon is only averaging 3.33, and Harris is only averaging 3.18. When we take that into perspective, the fact that Barkley's averaging more yards per carry after contact than Najee Harris is and Joe Mixon is just regularly, that is an unbelievable statistic. Barkley has been far too efficient. He takes on Jacksonville in a fantastic matchup. We have recently seen a lot of running backs find success against them. Whether we go back to Miles Sanders a couple weeks ago, 134 rushing yards on 27 attempts for 2 touchdowns. Whether it was, Dameon Pierce, 26 rushing attempts for 99 yards and a touchdown. And even Deion Jackson this last week, 23 fantasy points, got himself some work on the ground. And of course, 10 catches through the air for 79 yards, scored himself a touchdown. If in fact he was to stay healthy in that fourth quarter, probably would have had even more statistics. But this defense is giving up a lot of points to running backs recently. Saquon is definitely going to join that group. The final thing I wanted to mention before we continue on is, of course, his current prize pick number. They have him on more or less than 83.5 rushing yards. I think this is another week we could very easily see Saquon Barkley blow past that and continue to bring us W via prize picks. Moving on. We're talking about Rhamondre Stevenson. Now, you may be surprised, but for those of you who have Rhamondre Stevenson, this is a pleasant one to see. Of course, if you have Dameon Harris, the hope is that he's going to come back in a couple weeks, but the assumption is that he's most likely going to miss another week. And if that's going to be the case, there is a boatload of value to be had by Rhamondre Stevenson, and he has proven that year in and year out. Over the course of the last 2 years, when a New England Patriots running back, whether it is Rhamondre Stevenson or Dameon Harris, have been by themselves in this backfield, they have been able to average over 20 fantasy points per game. Solo New England running backs in this backfield. That's only happened 4 times, but 3 of them consisted of 23 plus fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. Of course, they take on the Chicago Bears, a 5-star matchup to say the very least. Besides the fact that Aaron Jones went for 30, Dameon Pierce went for 17, Barkley went for 17, Dalvin Cook went for 25, and even Brian Robinson went for 12 fantasy points with Carson Wentz completely selling the bag. This is an obvious matchup where we're starting them on Monday night against the Chicago Bears defense. This is a beautiful matchup to be had. As of this current moment in time, since week 4, Rhamondre Stevenson is the number 2 running back in terms of rushing yards, only behind Nick Chubb by a handful of yards. Outside of that, last week could have even had a hat trick in terms of rushing touchdowns, had himself 2 back-to-back rushing attempt opportunities on the 1-yard line. Unfortunately, was stuffed back-to-back times and didn't get himself a 3rd touchdown. An automatic play in my eyes, and our number 3. Moving on to our number 4, we have Josh Jacobs. Coming off the bye week, gonna look fresh because the last time we saw him, this man had a total of 59 touches in 2 weeks. Weeks 4 and 5, the guy was given 28 rushing attempts and 21 rushing attempts. That led to 144 rushing yards and 154. Obviously scored 3 touchdowns in those 2 games and has had 3 consecutive weeks of 5+ receptions. The fact that he has had 16 targets and 15 receptions from weeks 3 through 5 is absolutely outstanding. We've talked about this. Josh McDaniels wants to give his running backs the ball. That's exactly what he did in New England, and that's what's going to continue to happen. The fact that in the last 2 weeks, weeks 4 and 5, from the Las Vegas Raiders, we have only seen other running backs in this backfield touch the ball 8 times, and the rest of the time, the other 59 attempts have gone in the direction of Josh Jacobs. That is unbelievable. Obviously, they're going to have a couple weeks of prep going into this upcoming weekend's matchup. This is a 5-star matchup here going up against the Houston Texans, who everyone has succeeded against in terms of running the ball. I don't even have to list them. When we're talking about a running back like Josh Jacobs, who's coming off of a 32-point and a 28-point fantasy performance, of course, he's an automatic play. Moving on to Derrick Henry, our thumbnail for today's video, taking on a division rival in the Indianapolis Colts. Now, the last time he had an opportunity of taking on the Indianapolis Colts was in week 4 of this season. And in that contest, had himself 22.2 fantasy points. In the last 3 games, he has had himself a 69% snap percentage, 70 rushing attempts for 301 rushing yards, a 4.3 yard per carry average, 4 rushing touchdowns, 13 targets, 10 catches, 121 receiving yards, and 71.2 fantasy points. Of course, in 4 out of the last 5 games that he's taking on the Indianapolis Colts, he's surpassed 100 rushing yards. The fact that in week 6, the Jacksonville Jaguars running backs ran for 197 total yards against this defense leans me in the direction, of course, believing that Derrick Henry can have himself a 4th consecutive week of 20 or more fantasy points. He's going to, of course, get the ball 25+ times, and when he does, he's going to find the end zone once again. Let's go ahead and move on to Christian McCaffrey taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Even though this is a very difficult matchup in terms of running the ball, I don't expect this team to be running the ball. The amount of times that they have utilized him in the receiving game as of late speaks volumes. From weeks 4 through 6, they have targeted him 29 times. That has led to 23 total receptions. If we're going to continue to see that level of receiving upside, of course, Christian McCaffrey has value regardless of whether even he has 1 rushing attempt. The receiving work that he is getting is obviously going to lead to success. And whether it is garbage time or early in the game, it does not matter to me. The fact that we have seen him get targeted 32.6% of the time on his routes run, 89 routes run and 29 targets in the last 3 games. That high of a target percentage is very uncommon in the National Football League, especially when we're considering routes run to targets. But he's able to, sustain it. And we know that Christian McCaffrey, of course, his name is being swirling around in terms of trades that potentially may come up. But either way, if he's going to be ready to go for the Carolina Panthers this week, I'm expecting him to get a lot of passes out of this backfield and a lot of yards via the receiving game. And, he's had himself some success against the Buccaneers. Obviously hasn't played them in a couple years considering the injuries he has sustained. But the last time we saw him take on this defense, put up over 20 points. I'm happy to expect something very similar to that. Moving on to Leonard Fournette. All right, Leonard Fournette is also in a similar situation on the other side of this matchup in the idea that he is getting himself a lot of receiving work, and that is what is defining his fantasy season. In the last 4 games, he's been able to total 30 total targets and 28 receptions. That is unbelievable numbers. Last 4 games, that is literally 7 total receptions per game on average. When you're getting into that conversation, especially in a full PPR scoring format, where you're getting over a touchdown of fantasy points just in receptions alone, on top of the fact that he's getting yardage and scoring receiving touchdowns in the last couple weeks, that is incredible. Now, of course, many of us have seen the clip of Tom Brady absolutely ripping his offensive line a new one. And even with that being the case, Leonard Fournette still had 27 touches on Sunday against the Pittsburgh Steelers in that loss. But I think there's a very good opportunity here for a bounce back game. Of course, in that contest, Leonard Fournette had 2 opportunities inside the 5-yard line. Unfortunately, was stuffed on both occasions, did not score. But going into this week, taking on the Carolina Panthers, a division rival, they have found a lot of success. This is absolutely a get-right game for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers offensive line and Leonard Fournette. In the last 4 games that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have taken on the Carolina Panthers, Tampa Bay running backs have accumulated 39.9 fantasy points, 28.3, 28.0, and 19.1. I'm expecting a huge performance here from Leonard Fournette. Moving on to Breece Hall, our number 8. Yes, the rookie maintains his RB1 standing, and quite honestly, I think this is going to continue for the rest of the year. He has been so good, and the fact that even with Michael Carter digging in and taking about 30% of the total opportunities and yardage out of this backfield, there is still so much upside to be had from Breece Hall in an offense that, quite frankly, isn't even throwing the ball that much. This past Sunday against the Green Bay Packers completely tore them apart with 116 rushing yards, a 5.8 yard per carry average on the ground. Also gets himself a couple sprinkles of work in the receiving game, but not as much as we'd like to see. That all being said, in the last 3 games, from weeks 4 through 6, this man has scored a touchdown in every single game on the ground. When you go ahead and just look at the span of the last 3 games in general, as of right now, he leads all running backs in yardage over the last 3 weeks. As we continue, we're obviously going to be in a conversation where he'll have more opportunity in the receiving game, of course, on the ground. And the main reason is because he's been so damn effective. As of right now, he's number 2 amongst all running backs in the National Football League in terms of rushes of 10 or more yards. He has 14 of them. Nick Chubb leads the pack with 21. Obviously, that's great company to be in with. Outside of that, of course, on Sunday, could have scored himself another rushing touchdown, had 3 attempts inside the 5-yard line. Wasn't able to go ahead and accomplish anything more than that. Going into this upcoming week via Prize Picks, a 63.5 rushing yard number. I'm going all the way more with that number, taking on the Denver Broncos defense. They're going to continue to give him the ball. He's going to continue to light up defenses. Breece Hall, automatic start. Moving on, let's talk about Nick Chubb. Of course, we were just comparing the two in the category of rushes of 10 plus yards. Of course, Nick Chubb has been at the top of the list. Whether it is yards per carry, whether it is missed tackles forced, whether it is breakout runs. Nick Chubb is one of the most talented backs in the league, but on Sunday, he was obviously kind of shut down by Bill Belichick's defense. 7.5 points is not going to get it done, and it mainly has to do with the fact that this game's score was 24-6 in the favor of New England by the end of the third quarter, which obviously led to this team not being able to run the ball in that fourth quarter, second half, when they typically would like to kill clock in those scenarios. That all being said, this upcoming week, they take on the Baltimore Ravens. And though in the last 2 performances that he's taken on the Baltimore Ravens in 2021, he only put up 4.9 and 8.0 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format, we have to look at what we've recently seen from the Baltimore Ravens. Recently, we have seen running backs find success. Joe Mixon, 14 attempts, 78 yards, was stuffed on the 1-yard line, could have had himself a touchdown in that performance. Saquon Barkley, 22 attempts, 83 yards, could have had himself 2 touchdowns, but had himself 1. Nonetheless, what we have seen from the Baltimore Ravens offensively kind of gives me hope that we're not going to see a blowout. We're going to see a scenario where, similar to the last couple weeks, the Baltimore Ravens kind of slow down in the second half. If you go ahead and you isolate Lamar Jackson's statistics in the second half, passing completion percentage, passing yardage, everything is far lower than in comparison to the first half. When you go ahead and look at it, in terms of total points scored, the Baltimore Ravens in the last 3 games have 40 points in the first half and only 19 in the second half. It allows teams to make comebacks on them, whether it was Miami, whether it was Buffalo, whether it was the New York Giants this last week. Teams make comebacks, and why not Nick Chubb and the Cleveland Browns this week having themselves an opportunity and a dogfight this upcoming week against their division rival. Moving on to Alvin Kamara. Alvin Kamara obviously is a stud. He takes on the Arizona Cardinals on Thursday night in a short week. The only player that we know that is medically cleared to play, outside of the receiving options and quarterback, is going to be Chris Olave. Chris Olave has been fully cleared. He will be playing on Sunday. This does not affect the overall potential of Alvin Kamara, but I would like to say that Alvin Kamara has not scored a touchdown this season. And that is the biggest difference maker as to what we have seen in the past from Alvin Kamara. If he had already had himself a couple touchdowns here, we'd have him far higher ranked. But considering we are taking on a matchup against the Arizona Cardinals on a short week, typically we see Thursday games be lower scoring events between teams. Maybe we're just going to have to rely on the fact that Andy Dalton is going to be the quarterback. And with that being mentioned, in the last 2 weeks, we have seen a lot of targets and a lot of receptions in the direction of Alvin Kamara. And that is certainly something that we have missed when we have seen Jameis Winston under center comparatively. So if we're going to continue to see 6+ receptions like we've seen each of the last 2 weeks from Alvin Kamara out of this backfield, that is fantastic. On top of the fact that in the last 2 games, he's had 103 rushing yards and 99 rushing yards. The current Prize Picks number of 65.5. I mean, we got to go more on that number. You should go ahead and probably try to lock that in right now. Of course, promo code Andrew. Check that out today. Link in the description. Let's move on to Kenneth Walker. All right, Kenneth Walker, obviously, massive performance. We're going to continue to see these performances come out of the direction of the Seattle Seahawks offense as their offensive line with their 2 new starting offensive tackle rookies are absolutely dominating. When they're going to continue to commit to the run, of course, Kenneth Walker, who proved to us in college, his final year at Michigan State, is a machine. Whether it's missed tackles forced, whether it's yards per carry after contact, he will continue to dominate. I mean, already this season, in terms of missed tackles forced, he is 4th in the National Football League amongst all running backs, and he's only legitimately played 1 full game. Outside of that, last week against, the New Orleans Saints, week 5 against the New Orleans Saints, really only came in after Rashad Penny got injured. And even then only had 8 rushing attempts. This is a man that is going to make people miss. And when he does, especially against the Chargers, who are giving up 5.83 yards per carry thus far this season to opposing running backs, a lot of success can be had. I mentioned this last week. I'll mention it again. The Chargers, as of late, have given up 100 yards and a touchdown to James Robinson, 100 yards and a touchdown to Dameon Pierce, and 134 yards and 2 touchdowns to Chubb. 47 and a touchdown in that same game to Kareem Hunt. Latavius Murray even had himself over 66 rushing yards against that defense in the second half practically. And let's be honest, the current number of 65.5 rushing yards via Prize Picks, that is an absolute more. He's going to surpass that. Take that in this upcoming weekend's entry. Moving on to the final running back within our top 12 conversation, we have Dameon Pierce coming off of the bye week. He should be relatively fresh. The number one thing that I want to mention in regards to Dameon Pierce is effort. He gives effort unlike any other running back. The amount of yards he's been able to gain after contact is unbelievable. 4.17 yards per carry after contact thus far this season. That's 6th amongst all running backs in the National Football League right now that have a sizable enough workload in terms of rushing attempts to be in that list. On top of it, in the last 2 games, 11 targets, 9 receptions. The receiving totals are continuing to go up. And though they do trust Rex Burkhead in that capacity, he has seen more targets and receptions than Burkhead in the last 2 games. Going forward into this upcoming weekend's matchup against the Las Vegas Raiders, I think there's a lot of hope. I think there's a lot of potential here. And I'm very easily thinking we're going to find ourselves with Dameon Pierce having himself another explosive game. And that is why he's in our top 12 conversation. Let's go ahead and review our top 12 running backs for week 7 of the 2022 fantasy football season. Again, I'm throwing out a lot of stats and hopefully you're able to absorb them for as quick as I'm possibly trying to speak. Of course, to keep this a shorter video, but either way, I'm trying to give you guys as much context as possible. I do so much research, and the more I can give you, the more information that I can relate to you, the better decisions you can make by the end of the week, whether or not you follow my rankings, in order to give yourselves the best possible chance of winning a championship and your weekly matchups. Now, of course, if you want to help yourself even more, you can go ahead and join us Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. We have updated rankings every Sunday morning for all 4 primary positions on screen: running backs, wide receivers, quarterbacks, and tight ends, updated that morning in order to help you out. So join us Sunday morning. Thank you very much. All right, let's go ahead and move on, and let's talk about our RB2s, beginning with Joe Mixon. Joe Mixon, unfortunately, this last week had himself only 8 rushing attempts. In fact, that's only 1 of 9 performances in his entire career where he has single-digit rushing attempts in a game. The last time we had seen him ever get even close to that number and had single-digit rushing attempts was in 2019. It has been quite some time, but the fact that he did it against the New Orleans Saints is not a surprise to me. The New Orleans Saints are a very good run-stopping defense, and even though he was averaging 5.6 yards per carry, the offensive line is not sustainable enough at this point to get him a solid amount of work on the ground. Nonetheless, Joey Burrow, Jamar Chase, they took over. They dominated that game plan. Nonetheless, they take on the Atlanta Falcons. I think it's a decent matchup. The idea of him potentially going over 65.5 rushing yards via Prize Picks, I think it's very much so on the table. 4 out of the last 6 games, yes, he has been a little bit lower than that number. But if you can go ahead and see him get back to that 20-plus rushing attempt mark against the Atlanta Falcons defense, there could very easily be a huge game on the horizon for Joe Mixon. But as of right now, considering his low total numbers, the fact that he's not finding the end zone on the ground, we've moved him down into the RB2 conversation. Moving on to Jonathan Taylor. Now, the reason why many of us may be wondering, hey, why is Jonathan Taylor at number 14, Andrew? It's mainly because I don't know if he's even going to play this week. And if he is going to play, you're automatically starting him. You know this, right? He was your number 1 overall pick in your draft. You are going to fire him up if, in fact, he is available and healthy to go. Now, let me just go ahead and put this in perspective. Obviously, I keep telling you guys, yes, keep Jonathan Taylor. Trade for Jonathan Taylor. We want Jonathan Taylor rest of the season. If it wasn't for just me continuing to say this, hopefully the Deion Jackson performance that we saw on Sunday gives you more, of an influence to continue with that trend of keeping him, to trade for him, to go after him. Because Deion Jackson had himself 23 fantasy points in about 3.5 quarters of play. And he had himself 12 rushing attempts for 42 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown, but 10 targets, 10 receptions, 79 receiving yards. There was so much potential out of this backfield within this offense. They're getting back on track. And when in fact they do, and Jonathan Taylor is healthy, he's going to be in a good spot. Now, unfortunately, in week 4 against Tennessee, he had a 2.8 fantasy performance. He was averaging about, 2 yards per carry against that defense and fumbled. It was an unfortunate turn of events, but if he's active and available this week against Tennessee, I could very easily see a revenge game on the horizon. Moving on, let's talk about DeAndre Swift. Speaking of another running back that we're not 100% certain on as to whether or not he's even going to play this week, let's talk about his potential and what he has shown thus far this season. From weeks 1 and 2, he had himself 20 rushing attempts for 200 rushing yards. That's a 10 yard per carry average from the first 2 weeks of the season. Had himself a rushing touchdown, of course, had himself 40 plus fantasy points, was averaging an unbelievable number, even with the fact that he was dealing with an ankle injury. Now, going into this upcoming week, the whole question is whether or not he's even going to play. And even if he's going to, are we going to continue to see a wide majority of opportunities go in the direction of Jamaal Williams? Because we have seen Jamaal Williams prove once again that he is a dependable enough back to be given an ample amount of work out of this backfield and be trusted on the goal line. Of course, we have seen Jamaal Williams score 4 rushing touchdowns inside of the 5-yard line thus far this season on 8 rushing attempts. If in fact DeAndre Swift is going to get some of that love, that's fantastic. But either way, if DeAndre Swift is active, I think he's probably a top 12 back. He'll probably be adjusted by Sunday morning. But it's just a matter of whether or not he's healthy with that shoulder and that ankle. 2 influencing factors there that we're not 100% certain on going into this week. Let's move on to Aaron Jones. Now, speaking of a running back that we're not 100% certain on, despite the fact that thus far this season, from weeks 1 through 5, Aaron Jones was averaging 6.4 yards per carry, they have somehow managed to stop running the ball with him. He had himself 9 rushing attempts against the New York Jets defense of all. Can you imagine that? I went ahead and I did a little bit more research. I wanted to see the rushing attempts. I wanted to see why exactly this team was struggling. Offensive line got dominated by that defensive line this Sunday. I get it. It's not going to happen every single week, especially when we go into a great matchup against the Washington Commanders this upcoming week. I almost said football team. But we've seen multiple running backs just recently run the ball effectively against this team. Of course, the Bears running backs, 22 attempts for 142 yards most recently against them. Of course, Derrick Henry, 28 rushing attempts for 102 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. There is a lot of potential upside to be had against this matchup. And yes, we have heard LaFleur come out and say, and even Rodgers come out and say, we want to run the ball more, yet they don't do it. I wanted to go ahead, take a little bit of a deeper look. Thus far this season, weeks 1 through 6, Aaron Jones has played against 8 plus defenders in the box, a league low amount. Only 2.86% of the snaps that he has played has he seen 8 plus defenders in the box. The fact that they are not running the ball more with that level of opportunity with this offensive line is irresponsible in my opinion. The fact that Algier and Huntley for the Atlanta Falcons, they see 8 plus defenders in the box 37 to 45% of the time, just gives you an indication as to what we're talking about here. Aaron Jones is eventually going to break out. He's eventually going to score touchdowns. I'm hoping it's sooner rather than later, but man, is it tough to continue to take some L's on a weekly basis with the performances he's been putting up. Moving on to Ezekiel Elliott, our number 17. This is probably the highest I've had Zeke ranked because quite frankly, the matchups, the fact that Dak hasn't been under center for the entirety of this season has really been tough to trust Zeke. But by all means, he's coming off of a fantastic week of averaging 6.2 yards per carry against the Philadelphia Eagles. We had talked about it last week in the idea that he has had himself successful games against the Eagles. They've game planned over the last, 4 years against that defense at a pretty successful rate. And that's exactly what they once again did on Sunday in that night game. Kept it relatively close with all things considered. They take on the Detroit Lions. It is the easiest matchup. If I could distribute, honestly, I would say this is a 10-star matchup out of 5. Quite frankly, besides the fact that Stevenson went for 161 rushing yards against them, Penny 151-2, Dalvin Cook 96-1, Antonio Gibson 28-1, the Eagles backfield 126-3. There have been so many fantasy points via running back to put up against this team. It's just a matter of, where's Pollard in the mix? Is he going to siphon some work? And if in fact he does, is that going to make a big difference? As of right now, Zeke is handling 63% of the offensive snaps and handling 63% of the running back rushing attempts within this backfield. If that's going to continue to be the case, especially in this matchup, I'm expecting success. Let's move on to Jeff Wilson Jr. Despite the fact that he had a streak of 4 consecutive games from weeks 2 through 5 of 10 or more fantasy points, consecutive streak of games of fantastic performances, it all disappeared. Literally 0.5 fantasy points for our fantasy teams. Unfortunate to say the very least. That all being said, I do believe he could very easily have a bounce back game here against the Kansas City Chiefs, as they have shown most recently that they're having a tough time stopping the run against some of these teams. Singletary, 85 rushing yards this past Sunday, and of course, most recently, Josh Jacobs, 21 rushing attempts for 154 and a touchdown. Of course, from weeks 2 through 5, when he was on this streak of having double-digit fantasy point performances, Jeff Wilson had 74-plus rushing yards in every single one of those games. Currently on Prize Picks, 63.5. We're taking the more on that in this upcoming weekend's entry. Even though he fumbled and he wasn't so successful this last weekend, unless Elijah Mitchell is back, I'm all in on Jeff Wilson. Let's move on to Brian Robinson, the starting running back for the Washington Commanders, going against the Green Bay Packers defense that has been brutalized recently. I mean, let's talk about some of the performances they have given up. The Jets running back, Michael Carter, and Breece Hall, they combined for 26 rushing attempts for 157 yards and a rushing touchdown. Both of them had red zone rushing attempts. Neither of them were able to accomplish a touchdown there. Also, the New York Giants recently, 19 attempts, 89 yards, 2 touchdowns from their running backs. The New England Patriots, 32 attempts, 152 and a touchdown. The Bears, 19 attempts, 160 yards. The Green Bay Packers defense cannot stop the run. The only thing that is potentially stopping the overall upside of the Washington Commanders this week is the fact that Carson Wentz is going to be out from 4 to 6 weeks, and Taylor Heinicke is going to be the quarterback. Luckily, we've seen Taylor Heinicke win this team football games back in 2021, and if we're going to continue to pick up off that and transition to being a run-first football team with the combination of Brian Robinson, Antonio Gibson, and Taylor Heinicke's ability to be a little bit more mobile than Carson Wentz, I think we're in a fantastic position to see ourselves another week of 15-plus rushing attempts and hopefully finding the end zone. Moving on to number 20, David Montgomery. David Montgomery was decent. Even though against the Washington Commanders, this offense really didn't look great, 4.5 yards per carry, we'll take that. I know this upcoming week it's a difficult matchup against the New England Patriots. They haven't given up a single rushing touchdown to an opposing running back this season. Yet they're giving up 4.37 yards per carry. They've given up, 122 rushing attempts for 533 yards, similar to what we showed earlier today on the episodes in the matchup portion. But the main difference maker, in my opinion, from David Montgomery having a great week in week 6 to having his average 8.5 points that he put up was the goal line rushing attempts. Khalil Herbert and Justin Fields both had a rushing attempt inside the 5-yard line. Unfortunately, both of them were stuffed. If you go ahead and you put David Montgomery on the goal line, you run him off tackle, he scores, in my opinion. Because we've seen him multiple times this season have a lot of effectiveness in that game, in that scheme. So going into this upcoming week, even though it is a difficult matchup and Bill Belichick has just recently shut down Nick Chubb for 7.5 fantasy points, I still think that there is a realm of possibility that David Montgomery could find some success here. Let's move on to Travis Etienne, our number 21. I am continuing the trend, Travis Etienne, in the positive direction because they're giving him more opportunities and he is delivering with a lot of yardage in said opportunities. In the last 2 weeks, 20 rushing attempts for 157 rushing yards. That is incredible. 7 targets, 5 catches for 65 receiving yards. When you're getting over 10 yards per reception, my goodness, get him in the receiving game far more often. Line him up out wide. Line him up in the backfield every single play. I do not care. We talked about it on stream last night. The guy's averaging 5.6 yards per carry this season. He's coming off of a week in which he was averaging 8.6 yards per carry. They take on the New York Giants, an advantageous matchup in my opinion, and the fact that we have seen back-to-back weeks of over 11.8 fantasy points from this running back, I'm all in. The fact that Kenyan Drake just went for 10 rushing attempts and, what was it, 119 rushing yards and a touchdown against that defense, a couple massive runs. If it wasn't for the fact that JaMychal Hasty had a massive rushing touchdown that siphoned away from Etienne, and the fact that Etienne's sole red zone rushing attempt inside the 5-yard line was a wildcat play in which he was stuffed, and the fact that Trevor Lawrence had 2 rushing touchdowns on Sunday, if it wasn't for all of that pain and suffering, Etienne very easily would have been, in that top 12 conversation by the end of week 6. Moving on, let's talk about Rhaeem Mostert. All right, Rhaeem Mostert, as of right now, is going to be the starting running back of this team. Barring an injury, he is going to continue to dominate the touches. And in fact, in the last 2 weeks, outside of his rushing attempts, Chase Edmonds has only had 3 rushing attempts in the last 2 games. That is unbelievable. This upcoming week, they take on the Pittsburgh Steelers. And with the potential of Tua coming back, this offense continues to get themselves more opportunity. The number that I first and foremost wanted to mention to you guys in regards to the potential of Rhaeem Mostert, even though this last Sunday, their left tackle, Terron Armstead, was out with a toe injury. Hopefully he's going to be back. And if he is, there's going to be a lot of success to be found here against the Pittsburgh Steelers, who have been quite susceptible to good running backs and a lot of yardage on the ground. Over the course of the season thus far, Rhaeem Mostert has only seen 8+ defenders in the box 8.45% of the time. We talked about it a little bit earlier on today's episode with Aaron Jones, seeing about 2.8%. And, guys like, Caleb Huntley and Tyler Algier for the Falcons, seeing, I think, 8+ defenders in the box 37 to 45% of the time thus far this season. The main reason of that is because of Waddle and because of Tyreek Hill. They cannot stack the box because they have to play cover 2 all day long. They have to simply just double cover those guys. And when they're not able to, the running attack will continue to explode for big plays. Moving on to Kenyan Drake. Now, speaking of seeing a lot of defenders in the box, Kenyan Drake thus far this season has seen a league high of 54% of the time, 8 defenders or more in the box against him. Yet, this past Sunday, had himself a massive performance against the New York Giants. Now, the whole question is whether or not J.K. Dobbins' injury is going to hold him out, or maybe we're going to see another committee situation this upcoming week. But if Kenyan Drake is healthy and ready to go, this is a guy that I am mentioning that you should probably be going after, not as the number one waiver wire priority, but someone that you can potentially pick up and have for a couple weeks here until we see what this backfield pans out to be with Dobbins and, of course, Gus Edwards. Most recently, the Cleveland Browns have been giving up a boatload of points to opposing running backs. Stevenson could have had 3 touchdowns, but had 76 yards on the ground and 2 touchdowns, over 23 fantasy points. Ekeler, 173 on the ground and a touchdown, while Kelly in that same game, 49 and a touchdown. The Atlanta backfield had 199 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns against Cleveland. These are just the most recent games. And the fact that, of course, Kenyan Drake saw, a couple burst runs on Sunday against the Giants, had 3 runs of over 15 yards, 2 runs of 30 yards and 1 of 15 yards. I think that is a conversation that we want to get into because this team needs explosive plays. And if they're not going to get that from Dobbins, of course, Kenyan Drake can supply them. Let's move on to the final running back within the top 24. It is Latavius Murray. Latavius Murray going into the week is going to be the starting running back of this team. And the fact of the matter is, Melvin Gordon is most likely going to be traded or cut. And if that's going to continue to be the trend, of course, we have seen Latavius Murray thus far this season in the 2 games that he has played, whether it has been with the Denver Broncos or the New Orleans Saints, succeed. In the games, he's had 26 rushing attempts for 123 yards. It's a 4.7 yard per carry average and 1 rushing touchdown. That level of potential success, I'm all in on, especially against the New York Jets. Of course, with this offense struggling in terms of passing the ball, of course, with Russell Wilson dealing with a back injury and a quad injury and all these kind of things, letting Russ cook is an absolute disaster. He's burning all the food. But as of right now, Latavius Murray seems like he could very easily be an RB2 option in an offense that is in desperate need of finding a running game to keep the ball out of Russ's hands. All right, let's go ahead and talk about our top 24, closing it out with our 13 through 24. This is the visual representation for you guys. Again, this is going to kind of encapsulate where I'm going, how I think it's all going to stack up by the end of the week, giving you guys a little bit of a representation here. Of course, if Jonathan Taylor and DeAndre Swift are going to be active and are going to be starting this week, they're in the top 12 conversation and will eventually bump players down on Sunday morning. Join us 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Kickoff with Kirchhoff, updated rankings every Sunday morning. Thank you very much. All right, let's go ahead and let's continue on to the RB3 conversation. I want to first and foremost preference that I think that these RB3s are all a joke. And if you start them, best of luck. It is very difficult to navigate the RB3 conversation. They are very difficult to trust. Beginning with Najee Harris. I'm going to go relatively quickly through these players. Najee Harris was able to find himself the end zone. I mentioned it last week. If Najee Harris is lucky enough to fall into the end zone, he's going to be a relevant fantasy play. Otherwise, he has been playing like an RB3. He continues to trend in that direction. Averaging 3 yards per carry on Sunday last week against Tampa Bay. Not really a surprise. It's a good defense. But I do want to mention a couple things. Despite the fact that the Miami Dolphins have recently given up a lot of points to opposing running backs, mainly from Mixon going for 61 and a touchdown. Carter going for 2 touchdowns in that game against the Jets. Of course, Hall that same game, 97 yards and a touchdown. Recently, Dalvin Cook on 13 attempts, 77 yards and a touchdown. Even though those performances exist and they are noted and they are, duly going to play an impact into where I rank him. And that's kind of why I have him at 25 rather than somewhere lower. The biggest problem I have is his efficiency. Thus far this season, he is averaging 3.18 yards per carry on average. That level of production is pathetic. When you go back to last season, at least he was averaging 3.9 yards per carry. But he had 307 rushing attempts. With those 307 rushing attempts, it led to 1,200 rushing yards. This season, he is on pace to only accumulate 235 rushing attempts. That is literally a drop-off of 70 attempts that we are going to be missing from his scoreline. And that is the reason why I'm moving away from Najee Harris, and I have him at 25. Moving on to Tony Pollard. This is a beautiful matchup, but we don't know if Tony Pollard is going to be given a lion's share of the work. We don't know if this is going to be a blowout in the direction of the Dallas Cowboys where Tony Pollard can absolutely tear them up in the second half. We've mentioned it in regards to Zeke, but this team, I mean, just the points alone, 22.38 points per game, just off rushing statistics per week. The amount of touchdowns they have given up to opposing running backs is ungodly, and the yardage is unreal. We mentioned it already. But the whole question is whether or not Pollard, with the 40% of snaps that he's playing, about 43.5%, and the 37% of rushing attempts that he is earning from this backfield, if that's going to be enough. In my opinion, I think it may just be enough to be a high-end RB3 option, but the end zone is going to be the biggest difference maker for him this week. Moving on to James Robinson. James Robinson has kind of slowed down, and even though he had a red zone rushing attempts, which he failed on, and so did Etienne, and both those rushing attempts eventually turned to Trevor Lawrence rushing touchdowns, I do expect to see a continued upward trend of Etienne getting an expanded role in this offense. And even if we do see James Robinson rush the ball 12 to 15 times per week, Etienne's expanded role will continue to lead him to being a more valuable prospect. So as of right now, yes, James Robinson is of value in the matchup and will always have the opportunity of getting rushing attempts and a potential rushing touchdown. But outside of that, typically a lower value guy in my eyes. Going on to Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Obviously, this is a matchup which I am not happy about. The Kansas City Chiefs taking on the San Francisco 49ers is going to be a tough matchup. This all being said, the biggest question that I had going into the week is whether or not Clyde Edwards needs a touchdown to be relevant. Thus far this season, if you go ahead and exclude the 5 touchdowns he has scored, he would only be averaging 7.88 fantasy points per game. So if in fact you do expect to see him scoring a touchdown, then great, you should play him because then he's going to score, 13 plus points. But I think this is very similar numbers to what we're seeing from Kareem Hunt. Kareem Hunt, without scoring touchdowns, is getting more fantasy points per game, in terms of yardage and receptions. That should just kind of give you some perspective. So as of right now, Clyde Edwards, I don't know if he's going to score a touchdown. And because of that, he's a lower end RB3. Let's move on to A.J. Dillon. Listen, A.J. Dillon is a fantastic running back. And please, if you give him more opportunities, he would be able to dominate. 10 rushing attempts, 41 yards. I know 4.1 yards per carry against the Jets isn't great. The offensive line was getting brutalized. If this team is going to be a run-first football team, which, I think that's what they wanted to be before the season began because of Devontae Adams' departure, the fact that they're only running the ball just under 24 times per game is pathetic. They got to be running the ball 35 times per game. Quite frankly, that is my opinion. And until they get there, it's going to be tough to trust this running back because we know that the running backs on this team are not scoring touchdowns. And if that's going to continue to be the case, despite the fact that the Bears tore up this defense and, of course, Derrick Henry recently tore up this defense, it's tough to trust a Green Bay Packers running back right now. Moving on to Jamaal Williams. Speaking of touchdowns and trusting running backs, as of right now, because Jamaal Williams is such an influential part of this goal line attack and the red zone scheme of this team, the fact that we are going to see DeAndre Swift come off of potentially his injury and maybe be limited at some capacity, this may lend to Jamaal Williams continuing to get rushing attempts and continuing to get rushing touchdowns. And if he's going to continue to be in that realm, of course, his value remains in the top 30 conversation, maybe even higher if he finds himself in the end zone and even involved in the receiving game. Moving on to Kareem Hunt. Speaking of someone who obviously can get himself fantasy points without a touchdown, but is in desperate need of a touchdown. On Sunday against the New England Patriots, despite the score being 24-6 at the end of the third quarter, Kareem Hunt only saw 1 target. I don't know what the heck is going on, but the running backs for this team just completely disappeared. Bill Belichick made it a point and made it a statement that, yes, if you guys want me to test you, I'll test you purely and make Jacoby Brissett have to beat me. And he tried to do that, and Jacoby Brissett obviously couldn't get the job done. That all being mentioned, I think Kareem Hunt against the Baltimore Ravens hasn't had himself a successful career against them and is certainly going to have to get himself receiving work to be relevant in the matchup, which makes it a difficult play. Moving on to Eno Benjamin. Eno Benjamin, as of right now, may not even be healthy. And if that's going to be the case, we may have Keontae Ingram as the starting running back of this team because we know that James Conner is day-to-day with his rib injury, according to Cliff Kingsbury. They may have the fourth string running back, in fact, starting against the New Orleans Saints. I'm not excited about the matchup. I'm not excited about the potential of an injured back. Eno Benjamin unfortunately got injured. For those of you who were wondering as to why he didn't perform well enough, obviously that was the leading factor on Sunday as to why his performance wasn't at a higher level. And quite frankly, this team does not look like they want to use running backs. They look like they just want to run the ball with Kyler Murray and, of course, throw and not make plays. on a consistent basis. Moving on, we have Michael Carter as our number 33. Michael Carter, even though he is only getting 30% of this backfield, I mean purely 30%, I went ahead and did the calculations. I'll go ahead and convey them to you guys. As of the course of the last 3 weeks, Michael Carter has seen 31.25% of the rushing attempts out of this backfield. He's gotten himself 37.5% of the total targets out of this backfield, and he has gotten himself 29.5% of the total fantasy points out of this backfield. So about 30% of the work is going in his direction, and 30% of the outcome is coming into his direction. So if we're looking for 30% against a relatively advantageous matchup, I'll take it as my number 33 back. Moving on, Antonio Gibson takes on the Green Bay Packers. With Carson Wentz out, there should be more utilization out of the running backs from this team. Whether it is on the ground or through the air, Antonio Gibson should get more work. As to whether that cuts into the direction of Brian Robinson, I doubt it, considering how poorly the Green Bay Packers have played. They're gonna keep themselves in this game. The Washington Commanders, they're going to be in the conversation, even with Taylor Heinicke. And with that all being the case, Gibson, quite frankly, it's either him or McKissick. As of right now, I'm leaning the direction of Gibson, but it could go either way, especially in a full PPR format. Moving forward, we have Nyheim Hines. Speaking of a PPR format, the fact that Deion Jackson had himself 10 targets and 10 receptions on Sunday leads me to believe that Matt Ryan's going to continue to target the backfield. And of course, we saw that earlier this year, weeks 1 through 3. You guys see those targets that Nyheim Hines and both Jonathan Taylor received. If they're going to continue to increase those numbers, by all means, Nyheim Hines, coming off the concussion protocol and a week off, could be in a position to catch a lot of passes and be fantasy relevant in that regard. Moving on to our final running back I wanted to mention, it is Caleb Huntley. I mean, quite frankly, you could play Tyler Algier here, you could play Avery Williams, you could play anybody here, but of all the running backs that I trust, quite frankly, it is just Caleb Huntley out of the backfield until we see Cordero Patterson return. This is a backfield that is being a 50-50 split between Algier and Huntley in terms of rushing attempts. Obviously in the favor of Huntley this last weekend, 16 attempts to 15. Cincinnati Bengals are not an easy matchup, so unless he's falling into the end zone, something that I'm very seldom going to trust. That's going to cover today's episode. Hopefully you guys enjoyed all the information. If you did, subscribe to the channel. Help us get to 70K subscribers. Click the like button down below. Be a friend. Tell a friend. I understand that it's difficult to share your fantasy secrets, but it'd be greatly appreciated from me and all the efforts that I put forward. Thank you guys. Be sure to go ahead, check out Prize Picks. Again, use promo code Andrew today. We talked about a lot of potential entries that you can go ahead and make in terms of rushing yards at the running back position. So go ahead, use promo code Andrew, make a first-time deposit. And when you do so, you'll be given a first-time deposit match up to $100. So for those of you interested in getting more fantasy in your life, more daily fantasy at your fingertips, Prize Picks is the way to do it. Check that out. Use promo code Andrew today. Thank you very much. Tomorrow, we'll talk about our wide receivers at the top 36 capacity. And until then, I'll see you guys. Peace.